Picture a hunting party 60,000 years ago, crouched in tall grass at dawn. A herd of wild horses grazes a few hundred meters away. One wrong move, one nervous cough, one twig snapping under the wrong foot, and the entire herd bolts, taking weeks of food with it. Someone has to decide the exact moment to strike. Someone has to decide who circles left, who circles right, who throws first. There's no rank insignia here, no badge, no official chain of command. So who's calling the shots? If your mental image is a giant brute pointing a spear and barking orders while everyone trembles and obeys, you've basically just described a Hollywood movie, not real prehistoric life. Because the actual answer is stranger, more democratic, and honestly more impressive than the caveman king cliché we've all absorbed from pop culture. So let's ask the real question. With no elections, no thrones, no written laws, and no police to enforce anyone's authority, how did early humans figure out who got to lead? And here's the twist that makes this worth the next 20 minutes of your time. The answer might explain something about your own boss, your own government, and honestly, your own brain. Let's start by killing the myth. For most of human history, and we're talking well over 90% of the roughly 300,000 years our species has existed, there were no permanent leaders in the way we think of them today. No presidents, no CEOs, no hereditary kings. Humans lived in small, mobile bands, usually somewhere between 20 and 50 people. Everyone knew everyone. There was no anonymity, no stranger walking into camp you'd never seen before. Your entire social universe was these few dozen faces around the fire. And in a group that small, something interesting happens to power. You can't hide behind a title. You can't fake competence for long. If you claim to be the best tracker and then get everyone lost in the desert, that reputation is finished by sundown. So leadership in this world wasn't a position. It was a temporary loan. Anthropologists studying groups like the Hadza in Tanzania or the Juhonsi in the Kalahari, societies that still live in ways that echo our deep past, have documented something called situational leadership. Basically, different people take charge depending on what problem needs solving. Tracking a wounded animal for 3 days across rocky terrain, the most experienced tracker leads temporarily, no vote required. A child gets a fever no one recognizes. Suddenly the group turns to whoever has treated something similar before, often an older woman with decades of accumulated plant knowledge. A neighboring band shows up wanting to negotiate territory. The most persuasive, calm-headed talker in the group becomes the most important person in camp for exactly as long as the negotiation lasts. A river needs crossing during flood season, with children and elders in tow. Suddenly, the person who knows the water best, who has crossed it a dozen times before in every possible condition, becomes the de facto commander for those 20 dangerous minutes, and everyone else, including people who might outrank them in every other context, simply defers. The moment the task ends, so does the authority. It's less kingdom and more a flash mob of specialists, each stepping forward exactly when their skill is needed and stepping back the second it isn't. This wasn't a lucky accident either. It was, in a sense, an evolutionary safety mechanism. A tribe that always followed the same person regardless of the situation was gambling everything on one person's judgment, one person's blind spots, one person's limitations. A tribe that redistributed leadership based on expertise was spreading its risk, playing the odds far more intelligently. Nature doesn't reward the tidiest org chart. It rewards whatever structure keeps the most people alive through the widest range of unpredictable disasters. And shifting leadership turned out to be remarkably good at exactly that. Now here's the part that surprises people most. You'd expect that in a world with no laws, the biggest and most violent person would simply dominate everyone else through fear. That's certainly how chimpanzee troops work. Alpha males rule through intimidation and everyone else falls in line, grooming the boss, avoiding his gaze, surrendering food the moment he demands it. Humans, it turns out, actively rebelled against this model, and rebelled hard. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm spent years analyzing dozens of hunter-gatherer societies across the globe and found a consistent, almost universal pattern. Groups actively suppressed anyone trying to dominate the rest. He called it a reverse dominance hierarchy. Instead of one strongman ruling the group as a whole ruled any individual who got too big for their boots. If a hunter came home and bragged too loudly about his kill, he'd get mocked, sometimes brutally, until he learned to downplay it. If someone tried bossing others around outside of their area of expertise, people would simply stop listening, ignore him mid-sentence, turn their attention elsewhere deliberately so the message landed. And because bands weren't stuck in one location, dissatisfied members could quite literally pack up and join a rival group. No leader could force loyalty through fear when everyone had an exit door built directly into their daily life. Families splitting off to join a neighboring band wasn't rare or dramatic. It was a normal pressure valve, one that quietly kept every aspiring tyrant in check long before things escalated to violence. Try running a dictatorship when your entire population can vote with their feet overnight. It simply doesn't work. And our ancestors, whether they consciously realized it or not, had built a society almost perfectly designed to prevent it from ever taking root. So if not fear, then what actually earned someone influence? Two things, over and over across cultures that never had any contact with each other, separated by oceans and thousands of years. Competence and generosity. Competence is obvious enough. If your life depends on tracking a wounded bison correctly, you don't follow the loudest guy in camp, you follow the guy who's done it successfully for 20 years. Competence without a track record meant nothing. Actions were the only currency that mattered because everyone could watch you fail in real time, and a single catastrophic failure could undo years of built-up trust in a single afternoon. Generosity is the more counterintuitive one. You'd think the best hunter would want to keep the biggest share of meat for himself. Instead, in society after society, the opposite happened. Successful hunters who shared generously gained enormous social standing, while hunters who hoarded were quietly frozen out, excluded from future cooperation, whispered about, avoided. This wasn't kindness for its own sake. It was insurance. No one succeeds on every hunt. Some weeks you come home with more meat than your family can eat. Other weeks you come home with nothing but bad news and tired legs. By sharing today, you guaranteed the group would share with you on the day you came home empty-handed. Over enough generations, generosity became one of the most valuable currencies a person could hold, arguably more valuable than the meat itself, because meat spoils and reputation doesn't. There's a fascinating pattern anthropologists call leveling mechanisms, communal habits designed specifically to stop any one person from accumulating too much status. A hunter who returned from a great kill and loudly announced his own greatness wasn't admired. He was mocked, often harshly, sometimes by people who had contributed nothing to the hunt at all, purely as a social corrective. The food was still shared. Everyone still ate, but the credit was deliberately spread across the group, rather than concentrated in one ego. If that hunter pushed back and demanded recognition, insisted he deserved more status because of what he'd done, the group pushed back harder, because what looked like an argument about credit was really an argument about power, and the community understood, instinctively, without ever needing to articulate it in words, that letting one person accumulate too much of it threatened everyone's safety down the line. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it inverts almost everything modern culture teaches about ambition. Today we're taught to promote ourselves, to build a personal brand, to make sure credit lands squarely on our own shoulders. In the ancient world, that same instinct would have gotten you mocked around the fire until you learned to shut up about it. Here's another myth worth burying. The idea that one chief made every important call alone, issuing commands from some symbolic throne while everyone else simply obeyed. In reality, big decisions, should we follow this herd north? Should we relocate before winter? Should we trust this neighboring group enough to trade with them? Were often settled through long, sometimes multi-day group discussions. Elders recalled past droughts and how the group survived them. Hunters described animal movement patterns they'd noticed over the past several weeks. Mothers raised concerns about the safety of the very young and the very old on a long journey. Gatherers pointed out where familiar plants were becoming scarce, a subtle early warning sign that something in the environment was shifting. Eventually, not everyone agreed completely, but enough people leaned the same direction that a decision crystallized, quietly, without any formal vote ever being taken. This looks less like a monarchy and more like an ancient town hall meeting. Minus the microphones, minus the agenda printed on paper, but functionally doing exactly the same job that a modern committee does today. And this is exactly why elders held so much quiet power, disproportionate to their physical strength, which, by that stage of life, had usually declined considerably. In a world with no written records, no maps, and no internet, an elder's memory was the closest thing to a library the group possessed. They remembered the last catastrophic drought and precisely how the group had responded to survive it. They remembered the safe river crossing 3 valleys over, and the one that looked safe but wasn't. They remembered which berries killed you slowly, which ones killed you quickly, and which ones only looked dangerous. Losing an elder wasn't just an emotional loss, painful as that certainly was. It was the disappearance of an entire archive of survival knowledge, decades in the making, gone in a single afternoon, with no backup copy anywhere else in existence. This is likely one reason archaeological evidence shows many ancient societies caring for elderly members long after they could no longer hunt, gather, or contribute physically in any meaningful way. Their value had shifted entirely from the physical to the intellectual, and the group recognized that shift and adjusted accordingly, at a time when every extra mouth to feed represented a genuine cost the community had to absorb. Women, too, held influence that Hollywood has historically erased almost entirely from the popular imagination. In many hunter-gatherer economies, gathered food, plants, roots, nuts, tubers, and small game, provided more consistent and reliable calories than hunting ever did, particularly during lean seasons, when large game became scarce or unpredictable. That meant women often carried the deepest botanical knowledge in the entire group: what was edible during a famine, what eased pain during childbirth or injury, what looked appetizing but would quietly kill you within hours. That knowledge translated directly into real, tangible social influence, even without any formal title ever being attached to it. Some anthropologists also believe older women played major roles in resolving disputes between families, arranging marriages that strengthened alliances between different bands, and preserving the group's entire oral history through storytelling passed down from mother to daughter across countless generations. Leadership, in other words, wasn't always loud, wasn't always male, and wasn't always the person standing at the front of the group. Sometimes it looked like the quiet person everyone instinctively turned toward before making a genuinely hard decision, the one whose opinion carried weight precisely because it was so rarely offered carelessly. There's also the matter of conflict, because no honest account of ancient leadership can ignore how disputes within the group actually got resolved. Without courts, without police, without any written code of law, communities relied on a graduated, almost eerily consistent process across cultures that had zero contact with one another. It usually began with gossip, casual conversation that quietly built shared consensus about a problem before anyone confronted it directly. If that failed to correct the behavior, public criticism followed, delivered openly in front of the whole group, a serious social event with real consequences in a community that small. If that still failed, exclusion followed, sometimes gradual, sometimes sudden, and in a landscape where solo survival was nearly impossible, exclusion carried weight that modern social rejection simply doesn't compare to. Leaders in this world, then, weren't just people who solved external problems like hunts and migrations. They were often the very people trusted to help guide this delicate, high-stakes internal process without letting it spiral into open violence. There's one more dimension to this worth exploring, because leadership in the ancient world wasn't only about hunts, migrations, and internal disputes. It was also inevitably about conflict between groups. When two bands crossed paths over contested hunting grounds, or when raiding became a genuine threat during periods of scarcity, an entirely different kind of leadership sometimes emerged. One built almost entirely around courage and tactical judgment, rather than the generosity and consensus building that governed daily camp life. Interestingly, anthropological evidence suggests these war leaders were often kept on an even shorter leash than ordinary situational leaders. A skilled negotiator or tracker might retain quiet influence for weeks after their moment of usefulness passed, simply through lingering respect. A war leader, by contrast, was watched far more nervously, precisely because the skills that made someone effective in conflict, aggression, decisiveness, a willingness to take dangerous risks, were the exact same traits the group spent so much energy suppressing during peacetime. The moment the threat passed, that person's authority was often stripped away almost immediately, sometimes deliberately and pointedly, as if the community were reminding everyone, including the recent hero, that battlefield courage didn't translate into a permanent claim on power back at camp. This distinction mattered enormously, because it reveals just how carefully these societies distinguished between different kinds of competence. Being useful in one narrow context, even a dramatic life-saving context, never automatically earned someone broad authority over everything else. The best warrior didn't get to decide where the group foraged next. The best forager didn't get consulted on strategy during a raid. Influence stayed stubbornly tied to its original context, almost as if the entire social system had a built-in firewall specifically designed to prevent any one skill from quietly expanding into general political power. So what changed? If our ancestors were so good at spotting genuine competence and rejecting bullies, so effective at building leadership around trust rather than fear, why does the modern world sometimes reward the loudest, most confident person in the room instead of the most capable one? The answer comes down to scale. For nearly all of human history, Leadership was judged face to face, in real time, with zero possibility of hiding behind distance or anonymity. If you claimed to be a skilled hunter, people could literally watch you hunt, tomorrow and the day after that. There was nowhere to hide a bad track record. Reputation was earned daily, rebuilt daily, and lost in an instant if you slipped, in full view of the entire community that depended on your honesty. Then bands became villages, villages became towns, towns became cities. Cities became kingdoms and eventually nations of millions of complete strangers who would never personally verify anyone's competence, who would never watch their leader actually perform the tasks they claimed to be skilled at. Once you can no longer directly observe someone's ability, your brain falls back on shortcuts, because evaluating a stranger's true competence from a distance is genuinely difficult, and brains evolved to take the fastest reasonable guess available. Psychologists call this the halo effect, where confidence, height, a deep authoritative voice, or sheer charisma gets mistaken for actual underlying skill, even when there's little or no real evidence connecting the two. It's a shortcut that worked reasonably well in a band of 30 people who could catch a liar within a single week of close observation. It works far less reliably across a nation of millions who might never meet their leader in person even once across an entire lifetime. In other words, we're still running 40,000-year-old leadership software on hardware built for a world of 8 billion strangers, and the mismatch between the two explains an enormous amount of what feels broken about modern leadership. It explains why a confident voice in a meeting sometimes gets more credit than the quiet expert sitting 2 seats away who actually knows the correct answer. It explains why charismatic people can rise unusually fast and then fall just as fast the moment their actual competence gets tested under real pressure, when the illusion finally meets reality. It explains why entire nations sometimes elect the most entertaining candidate rather than the most demonstrably capable one, mistaking stage presence for genuine judgment. And if we're honest with ourselves, it explains why most of us have fallen for exactly the same trick at some point in our own workplaces, our own friend groups, even our own families, trusting the person who sounded most certain rather than the person who was quietly, consistently right. But here's the reassuring part in all of this. The old instincts haven't disappeared. They've simply gotten buried under layers of modern noise, distance, and spectacle. Think for a moment about the people you personally admire most in your own life. A teacher who genuinely changed how you saw something. A coach who pushed you without ever needing to raise their voice. A parent who stayed calm during a real crisis while everyone else panicked. A manager who quietly absorbed blame that wasn't theirs to protect their team. Chances are, none of them earned your respect through sheer volume or self-promotion. They earned it the exact same way a good hunter earned it 40,000 years ago, by being reliably useful over a long stretch of time. By sharing credit instead of hoarding it, and by staying steady precisely when things went wrong and everyone else was looking for someone dependable to follow. Modern research on leadership, across countless studies and countless cultures, keeps circling back to the exact same handful of traits, over and over, regardless of century, industry, or continent. Competence, honesty, fairness, generosity, emotional stability under genuine pressure. These are not modern corporate inventions dreamed up by a business school. They are the same qualities that would have gotten someone followed around a fire 40,000 years ago, just wearing considerably different clothes and speaking a language none of us would recognize. There's something genuinely humbling in all of this once you actually sit with it for a while. Long before written law, before kings, before a single line of political theory was ever carved into stone or written on paper, our ancestors had already built a leadership system with real, functioning accountability baked directly into its foundation. Power had to be earned, publicly, through demonstrated action. It had to be shared consistently, or the community pushed back. And it could be revoked at any moment the instant it stopped genuinely serving the group, with no appeals process required and no need for anyone's permission. A leader who forgot that fundamental lesson didn't get impeached in any formal sense, didn't face a vote of no confidence, didn't receive a strongly worded letter. They simply woke up one ordinary morning to find that nobody was quite listening anymore. That conversations grew quieter around them, that decisions were increasingly being made without their input, and that the group had gently, almost invisibly moved on without them. It's worth pausing here to notice something else too. None of this required writing, institutions, or formal philosophy to function. No one sat down and drafted a constitution explaining why bragging should be punished or why sharing should be rewarded. These norms simply emerged generation after generation out of the basic mathematics of small group survival. They were refined slowly through countless real consequences rather than abstract theory. A band that tolerated tyrants tended to fracture, starve, or scatter. A band that rewarded shared, competence-based leadership tended to survive difficult winters, difficult droughts, difficult migrations. Over tens of thousands of years, the bands practicing the second approach simply outlasted the ones practicing the first, and their descendants inherited both the genes and the deep social instincts that made that outcome possible. In a very real sense, the leadership habits we still carry today were shaped by natural selection just as surely as our hands or our eyesight were. Maybe that's the real takeaway hiding inside all of this history. Not that ancient humans were primitive compared to us, some rough early draft of a smarter modern species, but that in some very real, measurable ways, they built a smarter, more self-correcting system for deciding who deserved trust than a great deal of what eventually followed it. A system with no paperwork, no campaign advertisements, no polished speeches, and no elections in the modern sense that still managed generation after generation to consistently put competent, generous people in charge of the group's survival when it mattered most. So the next time you find yourself deciding who to follow, a boss deciding your next project, a politician asking for your vote, a coach asking for your trust, anyone at all claiming to deserve a position of influence over your life, ask yourself the exact question our ancestors would have quietly asked around a fire 40,000 years ago without ever needing to say it out loud to each other. Are they actually solving problems, or are they just making a lot of confident noise? Because in the end, that one simple question hasn't changed in 40,000 years. And judging by how modern leadership so often still gets this wrong, it's probably not changing anytime soon either.